The town of Grafton lay parched under a bleached sky, its streets etched with dust and resentment. The sun bore down mercilessly, warping the signs that hung above the saloon, the general store, the blacksmith's forge. On the cracked boards of the courthouse steps, a man in a battered brown suit adjusted his hat and unfurled a parchment, clearing his throat with exaggerated ceremony. "By order of the late Charles Whitlock's estate," the auctioneer announced, voice ragged and sunburned, "his properties, holdings, and all dependents are hereby offered to the citizens of Grafton and surrounding counties, effective this day." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, men shifting their weight, women fanning their faces, boys and old men spitting tobacco into the dirt. Tied to the post near the steps like a forgotten horse stood Eleanor. She was barely more than a silhouette against the courthouse, wrapped in a threadbare black shawl, a faded gray dress hanging loose over her frame. Her hands, bound delicately, in front of her with frayed rope, trembled against the heat. The bruises at her temple were yellowing but visible. Her dark hair clung damply to her face, matted and tangled, a halo of shame and defiance. She kept her chin lifted. "First item," the auctioneer continued, pretending not to notice her. "The Whitlock ranch house and its adjoining acres." Bids went up swiftly. Land was worth fighting for, but when the auctioneer, sweat pooling beneath his arms, finally turned to the post and said almost apologetically, "Next, the orphaned dependent, Eleanor Whitlock." A silence as heavy as a thundercloud fell. Men looked down at their boots. Women pressed their fingers tighter against their fans. No one moved. Everyone knew her story. Bastard daughter of Charles Whitlock, born from a woman whose name was never spoken. Unacknowledged, unwanted, unclean. Rumors swirled that her mother had been a drifter, or worse. And so Eleanor had been kept like livestock, hidden from polite society until even the law declared her a dependent asset. The auctioneer cleared his throat again. "She can cook, sew, help on a homestead. Strong constitution," he added weakly. Still no hands lifted. A fly buzzed near Eleanor's ear. She didn't flinch. "Come now," the auctioneer coaxed, voice cracking. "Surely someone has use for her." Laughter, mean and sharp, skittered through the crowd. "Not for a cursed thing like that," someone muttered. "They say her mother spoke to spirits," whispered another. Eleanor closed her eyes against the sun. She had no illusions. She knew what awaited her if no one claimed her, an existence beneath even servitude. The boarding houses would turn her out. The brothels would tear her apart. Still, she would not beg. The auctioneer turned helplessly in a slow circle. "Last call," he croaked, "before she's remanded to alternative placement." And then, a chair scraped against the dirt. The sound was small, but it cut through the air like a gunshot. From the shadows of the saloon porch, a man rose. He was tall, broad at the shoulders, his coat dusty and worn. A battered hat shielded his face, but not the jagged scar running down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. A gun belt hung, low at his hips, and though he carried no rifle, there was something lethal in the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like a predator deciding whether to strike. Cassian Holt. The name rippled through the crowd in horrified whispers. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. He lifted a hand, fingers curling once, an unmistakable gesture of claim. The auctioneer paled visibly. You mean to bid, sir?" Cassian said nothing. The auctioneer swallowed. "Very well, $1. No one countered. The gavel came down with a hollow crack. "Sold." The crowd parted like water as Cassian strode forward. Boots heavy against the dirt, he stopped in front of Eleanor. For a moment, neither moved. She looked up into his face. His eyes were a pale, dispassionate gray, storm clouds ready to break. Without a word, he drew a knife from his belt. Eleanor's heart stuttered, but she stood her ground. He reached down, and with one swift motion cut the rope from her wrists. The coarse fibers fell away. He didn't touch her, didn't drag her. He simply turned and walked to his horse, waiting by the hitching post. Eleanor hesitated. Every eye in the town was on her, waiting for her to collapse, to scream, to run, to confirm their belief that she was unworthy of even a criminal's pity. She did none of those things. She gathered her shredded dignity around her like a cloak and followed him. Cassian mounted easily, then leaned down, offering her his hand, the first true gesture of choice she'd been given in months. Eleanor took it. He lifted her onto the saddle in front of him, his arms loose but steady around her. The horse shifted, under their combined weight, but Cassian spoke softly into its ear, a voice too low for anyone else to hear. And it stilled. Without, a backward glance at the town that had sold her, they rode. Dust billowed behind them, swallowing the courthouse, the auctioneer, the hateful faces. Ahead, the open land stretched wide and wild. No promises, no safety, but also no chains. As the town disappeared behind the hills, Eleanor dared to breathe. She did not know where Cassian Holt was taking her, but wherever it was, it could not be worse than the place she left behind. And for the first time in her short, bruised life, Eleanor felt something dangerously close to hope. The horse's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the cracked earth, each beat carrying Eleanor further from the town that had sold her like unwanted cattle. Cassian Holt said nothing. The land sprawled before them, vast and indifferent. Dry grass whispered against their boots, and the sun bled into a red, bruised sky. Eleanor clutched the saddle horn, muscles aching, the fabric of her dress sticking to her skin. He led them away from the main trail, down hidden paths worn only by deer and the desperate. As the last light drained from the world, he slowed near, a cluster of boulders tucked into a hollow. Without ceremony, Cassian dismounted, then reached up to lift her down. His hands were rough but careful, like a man used to handling broken things. Eleanor staggered as her feet hit the ground, legs trembling. She caught herself before falling. Still silent, Cassian led the horse to graze and returned with a blanket and a small tin of beans. He struck a match against the heel of his boot and lit a tiny fire, its light barely enough to keep the dark at bay. He tossed the blanket toward her, an offer, not an order. Eleanor draped it around her shoulders, feeling its coarse warmth seep into her bones. She watched him as he ate sparingly from the tin, offering her the rest without looking up. She took it. Hunger outweighed pride. Around them, the desert sang a low, mournful song, the wind through stones, the distant call of an owl. Cassian leaned back against a rock, arms crossed, face shadowed. His eyes, when they caught the firelight, were unreadable. Eleanor wanted to speak, to ask why he had claimed her, what he wanted. If he would expect payment she couldn't give. But fear stitched her lips shut. Instead, she lay on the earth, wrapping the blanket tighter, staring up at a sky thick with stars. The ground was hard. The night air bit at her exposed skin. But for the first time in months, no one stood guard over her. No locked doors, no whispered bargains made over her head. Only silence, and a man who treated her like a person instead of property. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the crackle of the dying fire and the occasional snort of the horse. Once, in the deepest part of the night, she woke to find Cassian still awake, sitting against the rock, watching the darkness like it might come alive. He didn't notice her looking. Or if he did, he didn't mind. Eleanor closed her eyes again, letting exhaustion pull her under. Tomorrow, she knew, questions would come. But tonight, there was only breath, only survival. And the fragile beginning of something she hadn't dared believe in. Mercy. The morning sun peeled the cold from Eleanor's skin as she stirred beneath the rough blanket. Her body ached from the hard ground, but the silence woke her. A silence, too complete to be natural. Cassian was already moving, feeding small sticks into the fire pit. His coat hung from his shoulders, his face hidden under the shadow of his hat. Without a word, he tossed her a strip of dried meat and a dented canteen. Eleanor sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter, accepting the offering with a stiff nod. Her ribs still hurt from the rough handling days before, but she forced herself to stand. Cassian saddled the horse with steady movements. When finished, he simply waited, silent and unreadable. The choice was hers. Gathering what little strength she had, Eleanor stepped toward him. He lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing, mounted behind her, and together they rode into the growing light. The land stretched endless and raw. Dry grasses slapped against their legs. A lone hawk circled overhead. Time blurred into a monotony of hoofbeats and wind. Cassian guided them along narrow trails no one else seemed to use. By midday, they reached a shallow valley, where a crumbling cabin leaned against the hills. The porch sagged dangerously. The door hung crooked. Weeds grew wild around broken stones. It was a ruin, but it was shelter. Cassian dismounted first, tying the horse loosely. He shoved the door open with his boot. After a quick glance inside, he turned and waited. Eleanor hesitated. The idea of crossing another threshold, after so many that had led only to pain, made her chest tighten. But standing outside offered no better fate. She stepped in. Dust choked the air. A cracked table, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, a broken bed frame crouched near the wall. Cassian moved around the space, without urgency, inspecting it like a man used to making the best of wreckage. He found an old quilt inside a trunk and tossed it onto the bed frame. Then, without speaking, he crouched near the hearth, stacking kindling. Eleanor stood by the door, arms crossed tightly. What now? Was she to clean, cook, earn her keep? Would he demand something more? The fire caught, sending weak light flickering over the walls. Cassian sat by it, arms resting on one knee, eyes distant. Summoning courage she didn't know she had left, Eleanor asked, "Why?" Her voice broke in the middle of the word. Cassian didn't look at her. His answer came after a long pause, low and final. No one else would. That was all. No pity, no claims, no lies. Something in Eleanor's chest twisted painfully. She sank onto the floor near the fire, still wrapped. In the rough blanket, feeling smaller and more seen than she had in years. The wind rattled the loose shutter, but inside the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was shelter. A beginning, not of trust, not yet, but something quieter and older, the simple act of surviving together. Eleanor closed her eyes, the fires, warmth washing over her battered spirit. Maybe beginnings didn't need grand words. Maybe they only needed someone willing to stay when the world turned away. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the soft clatter of wood being stacked. Cassian was outside, splitting logs with a steady, brutal rhythm. Each swing of the axe was deliberate, a conversation between man and tool that required no words. The horse grazed lazily nearby, unconcerned. Eleanor pulled the quilt tighter around herself and sat up. Her muscles ached, but there was a different weight inside her chest now, something unfamiliar, not fear, not yet hope. She pushed herself to her feet and crossed the cabin carefully. The floor creaked under her bare steps, but the walls held. It was more than she had the day before. Near the hearth, a battered tin cup weighted with clean water. A small loaf of bread sat next to it, wrapped roughly in cloth. Cassian had left it without announcement. The silent offering struck her harder than any speech could have. She ate sparingly, savoring each bite. The bread was rough, but it tasted of something she hadn't felt in a long time, care without demand. When she finished, she stepped outside, the quilt still draped around her shoulders. The morning was crisp, the sun barely warming the dry ground. Cassian didn't acknowledge her immediately. He simply split another log, then another, his movements efficient, almost meditative. Eleanor watched him in silence, unsure if she should speak or remain invisible. Finally, she moved to gather the chopped wood, stacking it near the cabin wall. Cassian's eyes flicked toward her once, a glance so brief most would have missed it. But there was no anger in it, no reprimand, only something like acceptance. They worked together without words. She carried, he chopped. The pile grew steadily. By midday, Eleanor's arms trembled from the effort, but she didn't stop. The ache in her muscles was a kind of proof that she was still here, still capable of something beyond surviving. When Cassian finally set the axe aside, he handed her another piece of bread without comment. They sat near the broken porch, eating in the thin shade, the quiet stretching comfortable between them. Eleanor dared a question. "Did this place belong to you?" she asked, voice low. Cassian wiped his hands on his trousers and stared at the horizon. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Used to." 2 words, heavy enough to fill the whole valley. Eleanor swallowed. She didn't push further. Some wounds didn't need reopening to prove they existed. As the afternoon wore on, they repaired what they could. Cassian reinforced the door with scavenged wood. Eleanor swept years of dust and dirt from the cabin's corners. Neither asked for help. Neither offered thanks. It wasn't necessary. When evening came, Cassian lit the fire again. Eleanor sat near it, watching the flames dance. She realized she hadn't thought of Grafton all day, hadn't thought of the auctioneer, hadn't thought of the sneering faces. Only here. Only now. Cassian sat across from her, polishing a rifle with slow, methodical movements. His scarred hands moved with a tenderness that surprised her. Outside, the wind howled across the valley, but inside, the fire crackled steadily, holding the Zhu night at bay. Eleanor drew the quilt tighter around her and let herself breathe. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Cassian Holt would keep her here, or if he would decide she was too much weight to carry. But tonight she was not chained, not caged, not forgotten. Tonight 2 broken souls shared a roof, a fire, and a silence that spoke louder than any promise. And for Eleanor, it was enough. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud. At sunrise, Cassian would ride out alone, disappearing into the hills without explanation. By midday, Eleanor would gather water from the nearby stream, patch broken window frames with scraps of canvas, sweep dust from corners the broom barely reached. The silence between them grew familiar, no longer sharp-edged. At night, Cassian always returned, and at night they sat near the fire, 2 figures outlined by flickering light, saying nothing, sharing everything. Eleanor learned to read him in the small ways. The way his jaw tightened before a storm rolled in, the slight lift of his hand when he approved of something she fixed. Cassian spoke the language of survival, and she was beginning to understand. But even here, in this forgotten hollow, the outside world crept closer. It began with a horse's whinny, distant and sharp. Then 3 nights later, Eleanor noticed tracks near the stream, boot prints too deep and too fresh to be Cassian's. She told herself it was nothing, animals, travelers passing through. But unease lodged itself under her skin, refusing to leave. Cassian noticed it too. One evening, after returning later than usual, he spent long minutes studying the horizon before stabling the horse. His eyes, always cautious, had turned darker, more alert. He didn't say anything. He never did. But that night, he placed his rifle within easy reach of the hearth before sitting down. Eleanor lay awake long after the fire had burned low, listening to the wind rattle the loose shutters, listening to Cassian's even breathing from across the room. She thought of the town they had left behind, the men who had sneered, the women who had turned their faces away. She thought of what might be coming after them. It wasn't just fear of strangers that gnawed at her. It was the fear of losing what little they had built, the fragile piece stitched together from silence, labor, and the simple, stubborn act of staying. The next morning, Cassian left earlier than usual, his rifle slung over his back. Eleanor watched him ride out, a knot tightening in her chest. All day she worked restlessly, patching a torn blanket, sharpening the old kitchen knife until the blade gleamed. The sun dragged itself across the sky, slower than usual. When dusk fell and Cassian still hadn't returned, she paced the small cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under her bare feet. She didn't light the fire, she didn't dare. Instead, she sat by the window, the old shotgun Cassian had cleaned resting across her knees. Hours passed. The stars wheeled above, cold and distant. And then, A shadow detached itself from the darkness. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. She tightened her grip on the shotgun, the barrel trembling slightly in her hands. But as the figure moved closer, she saw the familiar cut of the coat, the slouch of the hat. Cassian. He moved carefully, glancing over his shoulder once before slipping inside. Only then did Eleanor let herself breathe. He said nothing as he bolted the door behind him. But his jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff. Danger was closer now. Much closer. Cassian sat near the hearth, checking the rifle with slow, deliberate movements. His face was carved from stone, but Eleanor could see the tension beneath the surface. Something, or someone, was hunting them. And this time, silence might not be enough to keep them safe. The wind howled through the broken slats of the cabin, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers. The fire burned low, throwing uneasy shadows across the room. Cassian sat by the hearth, his rifle across his lap, boots planted firmly on the ground. Eleanor watched him from the cot, the rough quilt clutched around her shoulders. He hadn't spoken a word since returning, but he didn't need to. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the door, then the windows again and again, the way his hand never strayed far from his weapon. It was enough. Outside, the night pressed closer, thick with unseen threats. Inside, the silence between them grew heavier, heavier until Eleanor couldn't bear it. She swung her legs off the cot and stood, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. Was it someone from town? She asked quietly. Cassian didn't look at her. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without lifting his gaze, "From the fire," he said. "Maybe." Just one word, but it opened a door to fears Eleanor hadn't dared name. Someone wanted her back. Someone thought she still belonged to them. Her throat tightened. Cassian glanced at her then, a brief flicker of silver-gray eyes meeting hers across the flickering shadows. "You're not going back," he said, voice low, certain. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a vow. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with the force of it. She crossed the room and sat near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, but not so close that she could touch him. That invisible line remained between them, as fragile and necessary as breath. For a while they sat in silence, the fire crackling, the wind howling beyond the thin walls. Then Cassian shifted, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a folded scrap of cloth, something stained and worn by time, and placed it on the floor between them. Curious, Eleanor leaned closer. It was a patch from an army uniform, faded, torn. She touched it gently, tracing the frayed edges with her fingertip. "You fought," she said, not needing him to confirm it. Cassian nodded once. "And lost," he added, voice rough. Not a loss of a battle, a loss of everything. She didn't ask for details. Some wounds bled deeper when spoken. Instead, she said, "Me too." He looked at her fully then, the firelight catching the scars that marred his face, the old sorrow etched into every line. Two people, discarded by the world, sitting on a cracked wooden floor, sharing their brokenness without shame. Outside, a branch snapped. Both of them tensed instantly. Cassian rose in one fluid motion, rifle ready, body coiled like a spring. Eleanor grabbed the shotgun by the hearth, her hands steadier than she would have thought possible a week ago. They waited. The seconds stretched into minutes. The fire sputtered low. Finally, the night settled again. No more sounds. No movement beyond the window. Cassian lowered the rifle slowly, his shoulders still tight with tension. Eleanor set the shotgun down carefully, heart hammering. When Cassian turned back toward her, something had shifted. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and crouched in front of her. Not touching, not pressing. Just close enough that she could feel the weight of him. "You're not alone," he said, voice barely a whisper. The words cracked something inside Eleanor more than any blow ever had. She nodded, once unable to speak. Cassian didn't ask for thanks, didn't demand promises. He simply stayed there, near her, as the fire burned low, and the storm outside battered the walls. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like a piece of property to be bartered, or a burden to be abandoned. She felt seen, and in the brutal language of survival, that was more precious than gold. When the fire died completely, Cassian stood and threw another log onto the hearth, coaxing the flame back to life. Eleanor watched him, her chest tight with something she didn't dare name yet. Maybe, she thought, survival wasn't the only thing possible anymore. Maybe, just maybe, there was something beyond the fear, something that looked a lot like belonging. The next days passed like a breath held too long. Each sunrise brought a strange peace, and each sunset carried the weight of things unsaid. Cassian worked on the cabin, reinforcing the windows with salvaged wood, setting traps farther out along the trail. Eleanor helped where she could, mending blankets, preparing food, tidying what little they owned. There was no schedule, no orders barked, only two lives moving carefully around each other, like dancers finding a rhythm neither had known before. Sometimes Cassian would be gone for hours, scouting the valley, checking the traps. Every time he returned, Eleanor felt herself breathe, again without even realizing she had been holding it. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and gold, she found him near the creek, skinning a rabbit he'd snared. He worked quickly, efficiently, but his hands weren't cruel. They were precise, respectful, the kind of man who knew loss and understood what it cost to take life to preserve it. Eleanor watched from a distance for a long time before stepping closer, her voice soft against the cooling air. "Teach me." Cassian paused, looking up. For a heartbeat, she thought he might refuse. Instead, he shifted the knife in his hand and nodded once. She knelt beside him, careful not to crowd his space. Cassian showed her how to hold the blade, how to make the first cut clean along the belly. His hands guided hers once, lightly, without trapping, and then let go, trusting her to continue. Eleanor's stomach twisted at the sight of blood, but she forced herself to keep steady. She had survived worse than this. When they finished, Cassian cleaned the blade with methodical care. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, heart pounding. It wasn't just about the rabbit. It was about being trusted with something real. As the stars bloomed above them, they carried the meat back to the cabin. Cassian built the fire higher, and Eleanor cooked clumsily but determinedly. He didn't criticize when the meat came out a little tough. He simply ate it, each bite a silent approval that filled her chest with a strange, aching pride. Afterward, they sat by the fire, a companionable quiet stretching between them. Cassian polished the old rifle. Eleanor stitched a rip in her only decent dress. Finally, she dared to speak into the stillness. "I'm not who they said I was," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I wasn't cursed. I wasn't born wrong. I just didn't belong to the right people." Cassian didn't look up, but he listened. She could feel it in the way the air shifted around them. "They tried to make me small," she continued, "tried to make me easy to forget." Her hands trembled over the stitching. She pressed the fabric flat to steady them. Cassian finally set the rifle aside. "You don't have to explain," he said simply. But Eleanor wanted to, maybe for the first time in her life. "They used to call me a burden," she whispered. "Said I'd never be wanted." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the chimney. Cassian's voice came, low and firm. "They were wrong." 2 words, enough to split the darkness inside her wide open. Eleanor bit her lip, the threat of tears sharp behind her. Please, he wasn't offering her a future, wasn't promising her forever. He was giving her something rarer, the right to exist without shame. The wind battered the cabin walls again, but this time, Eleanor didn't flinch. She leaned back against the rough wood, closing her eyes. Here, in this broken place, she wasn't someone's mistake. She wasn't someone's burden. She was just Eleanor. And in Cassian's silence, she found something she never knew she had been looking for. A home that spoke not in promises, but in presence. The next morning dawned heavy with mist, the sun a pale smear behind the clouds. Eleanor woke to the smell of damp earth and the distant murmur of the creek. Cassian was already up, moving silently through the cabin, checking the rifle, adjusting the leather strap of his holster. Something in the air had shifted. She felt it deep in her bones. A warning. Without speaking, Cassian handed her a small satchel. Dried meat, a canteen, a knife wrapped in cloth. He didn't need to explain. It was clear in the way his hand lingered for half a second too long. Be ready. Eleanor nodded, clutching the satchel against her chest. She spent the morning gathering water, her eyes flickering constantly to the ridgeline beyond the valley. The wind carried strange sounds today, an echo of hooves, the metallic clink of spurs. She returned to the cabin with her heart pounding, finding Cassian standing near the door, body tense, eyes sharp. "There's riders," he said, the first words he had spoken since sunrise. Eleanor set the bucket down carefully, forcing her hands to be steady. "From town?" she asked. Cassian gave a tight nod. "Maybe more," he added. They moved quickly. Cassian doused the fire to keep the smoke from giving them away. Eleanor checked the latch on the door, then hurried to secure the back window with a strip of nailed canvas. The hours stretched painfully slow. Afternoon deepened into a sickly gold, and then the sound of hooves broke over the hills. 4 men rode into the valley, their shapes sharp against the dying light. Dust clung to their coats, and the glint of rifles caught the last rays of sun. Eleanor crouched near the window, heart hammering. Cassian stood in the center of the room, calm, rifle cradled loosely in his arms. They waited as the riders dismounted. One of the men, tall and broad with a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his chest, stepped forward and pounded his fist against the cabin door. "Cassian Holt," the man bellowed. "Come out and hand over the girl. You've no claim on her." Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, the knife trembling in her hand. Cassian didn't move. He didn't speak. The sheriff tried again. "She's property, marked by Judge Wesson's hand. You're harboring a thief, Holt. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Inside, the silence stretched taut. Eleanor felt it. That choice, suspended between fear and defiance. Cassian turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. In that moment, without words, he asked her, "Will you fight for yourself?" Her grip on the knife tightened. Outside, the sheriff cursed and motioned for his men to spread out. Cassian shifted his weight, raising the rifle. One way or another, this would end tonight. Eleanor stood, blood roaring in her ears. She was done hiding, done letting others decide her worth. Whatever happened next, she would meet it standing. Cassian gave a short nod. Approval, trust, a vow all in one. Outside, boots crunched against gravel, drawing closer. Inside, 2 souls, battered and stubborn, braced against a world that had tried to erase them. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor wasn't just surviving. She was ready to fight. The first shot cracked the stillness like a lightning strike. Eleanor flinched as splinters of wood flew from the door. Cassian didn't hesitate. He moved with precision, stepping to the window and firing once, twice, reloading in a smooth, practiced motion. Outside, shouts erupted. Boots pounded against the ground. The sheriff's men scrambled for cover behind rocks and trees. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, clutching the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Another shot smashed through the thin wall near the hearth. Smoke and dust filled the air. Cassian's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. "Stay low." She nodded, crawling toward the kitchen counter, using it as a shield. From her crouch, she saw Cassian's silhouette framed by the broken window, calm, deadly, unmoving. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting because he had something to lose now, because he had someone to protect. Another shot rang out, grazing the window frame. Cassian ducked, then returned fire. A grunt of pain echoed from the ridge. 1 man down, but there were still 3 more. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. She couldn't just hide. Not this time. Quietly, she slipped toward the back of the cabin, where a second door led out to the woods beyond. She remembered Cassian's traps, buried snares and hidden pits he had set days ago. Thinking ahead like a man who had lived too long without safety, she just had to lure them closer. Heart thudding, she pushed the door open and slipped outside. The cool air slapped her face, but she forced herself forward, keeping low, weaving through the tall grasses. Behind her, gunfire cracked and echoed. She heard shouts. Someone saw her. Good. She ran, making herself a target, leading two of the men away from the cabin and toward the hidden traps. The ground gave way with a sharp snap. A scream split the air as one of the men tumbled into a snare pit, his rifle clattering uselessly to the side. Eleanor didn't look back. The second man hesitated, and that moment of hesitation cost him. A single shot rang out from the cabin. Cassian. The man dropped where he stood. Breathless, Eleanor stumbled back toward the cabin. She burst through the door, slamming it behind her. Cassian caught her glance, his mouth a hard line, but his eyes flashed something raw and fierce. Pride. Outside, the sheriff shouted curses. "You'll regret this, Holt," he bellowed. "You can't hide her forever." Cassian leaned his rifle on the window ledge, steady as stone. "You ain't taking her," he called back, voice carrying like a hammer. A beat of silence. Then, the sheriff's voice low and bitter. "This isn't over." Boots scraped against gravel. The last man mounted his horse, hauling the wounded with him. The sheriff cast one last look at the cabin, then turned and disappeared into the dusk. The valley fell silent again. Only the creak of saddles fading into the distance. Only the crackle of a dying fire. Eleanor sank onto the floor, heart pounding, arms trembling. Cassian closed the door quietly, sliding the heavy bolt into place. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Cassian crossed the room, crouching in front of her. "You all right?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, breathless. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I didn't want to just hide," she whispered. Cassian reached out, hesitated, then brushed a lock of hair from her face with surprising gentleness. "You didn't." Two simple words, but they landed heavier than any praise she had ever known. She had fought. She had chosen herself. And Cassian Holt, silent, broken, and steadfast, had chosen her too. Together they sat on the worn floor of the battered cabin, surrounded by the smoke of battle and the fragile promise of something stronger than fear. Together, they had stood against the world. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like a prize to be won. She felt like a partner, an equal, a home worth defending. The cabin smelled of smoke and sweat and old wood. But to Eleanor, it had never felt more like home. Cassian finished boarding up the shattered window, hammering the last nail into place. The sheriff was gone for now, but they both knew the world outside would never truly leave them in peace. Still, for the first time, they had carved out a corner of it for themselves. Eleanor swept the floor, her movements slow but steady, feeling the small weight of survival settle into her bones. Cassian glanced at her from across the room. No words passed between them, but something softer lived in his gaze now. A recognition, a quiet invitation. As twilight fell, they sat side by side on the cracked steps of the porch, staring out over the empty valley. The wind tugged at Eleanor's hair, and without thinking, Cassian reached out and tucked a stray strand behind her ear. His touch was clumsy, uncertain. It was perfect. Eleanor smiled, small and genuine, the first real smile she had felt safe enough to show in years. The stars blinked into existence overhead, one by one. After a long silence, Cassian spoke. "You can stay." Simple words, no demand, no expectation, only choice. Eleanor felt the depth of it like a stone thrown into a still pond, sending ripples through every cracked piece of her heart. She turned to him, searching his face. The scars, the hardness, the quiet hope he couldn't quite hide. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she said. Cassian's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled to life again, throwing a warm light through the broken window panes. Tomorrow, there would be repairs to make, more dangers to guard against, more wounds maybe to heal. But tonight there was this, the warmth of the fire, the steady presence of the man beside her, the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as a savior and the saved, not as a debt owed, but as two survivors who had found in each other something more precious than safety. A home built not from timber and stone, but from silence, trust, and the stubborn, aching miracle of being seen. Cassian stood and offered his hand. Eleanor took it, and together they stepped inside, into the battered cabin, into the life they would forge, into the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood, the kind of love that was chosen every day, in every small, stubborn act of staying. The wind howled across the valley, carrying away the last whispers of the past. Inside, the door closed, and for the first time Eleanor felt it. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they had fought for, full of everything they were about to build together.
In a world quick to judge, quick to abandon the broken and the lost, Eleanor and Cassian found something few ever do. Not rescue, not redemption through grand gestures, but a quiet, stubborn kind of love built from choosing each other, day after day. Tell me, have you ever met someone who made you feel seen, even in your silence? Someone who didn't demand you be anything more than exactly who you are? I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales where love rises from the ashes.